Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today what I want to show you is an easy way to basically paint a character. Any character in your army, because I'm not going to show you anything which is massively different to having painted Space Marines so far. Now the same goes no matter what it is you're painting. If it is Imperial Guardsmen, Genestealer Cults, anything of the like Chaos, it doesn't matter. All you're doing is one or two extra little details and you'll get something which will look really good to lead your army, because we're not trying to win Golden Demon here. So as always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below for this fella. Let's get started. Now the first thing you'll see is that I have already assembled this guy completely. It would probably be easier to paint him in two parts and then assemble him afterwards. But if you're anything like me, you might get a little bit keen sometimes and stick everything together before you've thought about painting them. So I do want to show you that it is still possible to paint these guys without having to pull them apart and try and reach that the hard way. What I've started by priming him is to give him an overall spray of black, and then from above I've given him a couple of thin coats of Wraithbone from the rattle can. Now, that will take time to build up. If you spray a very bright Wraithbone straight over black, it's not going to look perfect. So a couple of spritzes, and the idea then is that we get some shading underneath. This particular painting style I quite like because it's got a lot of texture, and that's not something you tend to see ordinarily on Space Marines or Astartes, whatever you want to call them. I like it though. So it is a style choice, one that you can skip if you'd like. If you find this difficult or you just don't like the look, just prime it in Wraithbone. Now the first color that we're going to apply is going to be to his cape. What I have here, this is German Grey from Vallejo. It is very similar to Corvus Black if you want to stick to Citadel products, but I think, just watch that go over the top in one fell swoop. There's a very good reason I'm using this rather than Corvus Black. The coverage is just much better. What I'm going to do is cruise around and cover over all of his cape. I'm doing this first because if we do end up with anything painted, I make a mistake, make a mess, it's going to be easier to clean up this stage than any of the armor later. Now, importantly here, getting to the back of his cape behind his arm. I'm going to tilt him sideways. It's a little bit easier to jam the brush back in there. But you'll notice as well that by having primed him black first and then angled my Wraithbone spray down at him, most of the back of his cape is still in black shadow, so I don't have to worry too much about getting in there perfectly, just enough so that from the front, yeah, that will look fine. Now as well as the cape, I've also done the weapons, so the handle there on his Crozius too, and the little bits in his joints in his armor that are going to be black. You could use a straight black if you want to touch those up later, but I don't think it's going to matter too much overall. What we'll do now is apply some green to him. Now, for my Death Guard, I like Lauren Forest, which is what I'm going to use here. But I know that other folks like using things like Elysian green, even Death Guard green. There's not really a right color here. Don't worry too much if you hit the trim on his shoulder pads, because we are going to paint those gold later. And looking at this fella, because from the front, a lot of him is going to be covered by his cape. What I am going to do is add a little bit of green to his pack. So this big section here, just so that there's a little bit more visual interest and he's not purely white. So shoulder pads and a couple of other little details, paint in the green. Now that doesn't take an awful lot of time. It will require at least 2 coats. On some of the flatter panels, if you've got big open shoulder pads, might even take a third, but it was just 2 on this fella, and that will work fine. What I'll do now is use Retributor armor, and we're going to paint in all of the gold details. Now for most of this, I am going to use a medium layer brush, but when it comes to doing the head of the Crozius rather, I might swap to a slightly larger brush and see how that gets on. Take your time with this one, and as much gold as you want to add, away you go. Now that's the part which is going to be the most time consuming. Now luckily Retributor armor does cover quite well over Wraithbone, but if you are painting a different legion, you might find you need to come back and give it a second coat in some areas. It's up to you. Now, really, you're painting for target priority, which is a funny sounding thing, but you'll notice here the Crozius, I've only painted it in gold. I could spend a little more time and paint the little wingling parts in silver or even a white, but for the purpose of getting a model on the table very quickly and just finishing an army, gold is fine. Your opponent will be able to tell from across the table what this bad guy is. What I have now is Eldar Flesh, and I'm just touching in the scroll work. Obviously some of these smaller details is going to depend on what you're painting, but like I said, don't overthink this stuff. Now there's not really a huge amount left to do. What I have here is another Vallejo color. This is Cavalry Brown. Now this is very similar, maybe a little bit lighter than Doombull Brown, so you can use that instead. But again, I'm looking at ways to save time, so the coverage here, I might have thinned that down a little bit too much, but the coverage ordinarily is much better. So over the brush here, and I'm also going to use this on the little leathery strap parts that we can see on his Crozius here. Now this fella doesn't have very many pouches on him, but a little bit of Dryad Bark is what I'm going to use for the leather. So as well as this little pouch here, I'm also going to use it to paint off the ties on the scroll work here. Now for the rest of the metal work, what I'm going to use is Iron Hand Steel. This one's quite light, and it works really well once it's been shaded. We don't really need to highlight it if we don't need to. So grenades, some of these little details. This is a great color to use to break up some of the rest of the shape of the armor. So if he's looking a little bit bland in some areas, you can pop on a little bit of this, and that will help to add a little visual interest. As soon as I did mention the silver on the Crozius, I knew I was going to end up doing it. Luckily, it doesn't take very much longer. It's quite cool. I think that's going to look a little bit better. What I've got now is some Wraithbone, and we're going to use this from the pot just to do a little bit of tidy up on areas where we might have splashed over. On the armor in particular, try, keep this a little bit sparing, because we'll actually be able to do some of the tidy up with our armor chipping later. But if you want a more pristine finish, you can finish that off now. You'll notice we haven't done anything with the plasma yet, but that's because we're going to touch on that later once the rest of the miniature is pretty much finished. What I've got here, this is an old Forge World army painting team trick. This stuff, marine juice. What it is equal parts of Nuln Oil, Reikland Flesh Shade, and Lamian Medium. Now you can make this from the new shades because the important part is really the medium. That's going to be what changes the flow properties and how this settles on the miniature. It's a little bit warmer than Agrax Earthshade, but not as red as something like a straight Targor Rage Shade, for example, would be. If you don't want to go to the trouble of mixing anything, then just thin down some Agrax Earthshade. You can use that, but I think spend a bit of time making up a few pots of this if you are going to paint a lot of Marines. What we're going to do now is just chuck it over the entire miniature. Really work it into the recesses. You'll see straight away how that medium helps it to stop from collecting on the flat parts. Away we go. I'm just going to cover the entire miniature. And once we've done with this, let it dry for about half an hour. And there we have it. There's most of the work done. So if I flip them around quickly, you'll see that that shade does even give a little bit of depth to that very dark off black that we've used. And everything else has plenty of shading. It's pretty cool. We could put them on the table like this. But I do want to take things a little further. Same as I would with normal infantry and what have you. But in this case, we're going to start with his cloak. Now what I have here, this is a little makeup brush. And I do recommend pick yourself up a set from Amazon because they make wonderful dry brushes. Nice and soft. And you'll find it's normally a little too hard to put too much on. I'm using here, this is Blue Grey Pale from Vallejo, and unfortunately there isn't really something exactly like it in the Citadel range. Administratum Grey is close, but it doesn't have the same bluish tint. Honestly, it's a matter of personal taste that I'm using this at all. As you'll see, just going over the extreme edges of the folds in the cape, we can get a little bit of volume and depth here without having to painstakingly highlight anything. And quick as that, we got a little bit of definition on the folds of the cloak. On the back here, I have put on maybe a little bit more than I might have liked, but honestly, try not to stand too much on things being perfect. Once we varnish this, Quite a bit of that is going to just blend together and look slightly more natural, so I'm happy to leave that like it is. We'll do the same thing now with some silver. I've got here Necron Compound, and it is the same brush, but I've made sure that it's thoroughly dry before doing this. Most of the gold and silver we are going to highlight a little more traditionally, but we can dry brush the croziers here, just catching the edges of both the silver and the gold. As well, you can do this over the weapon, whether it be a bolter or a plasma pistol, just enough to make that black a little more interesting. Now, as for the rest of the gold details, I would suggest using Liberator Gold. I have run out of Liberator Gold, so I've just mixed a little bit of Stormhost Silver into my Retributor armor to make a nice sharp gold highlight color. Don't need to do very much of this if you don't fancy, but a few really sharp little ding points on the miniature will make that gold look quite nice. You'll see here I've smudged a little bit of the gold onto his arm, wiped it away with my finger, but it is still visible. I'm going to cover that with a little bit of weathering, just to get rid of it. What I have now is some Blood Angels Red, and we're going to just dot in the eyes with a bit of contrast. I'd recommend maybe you might like Baal Red. This was a new one that came out. It's a little bit lighter. But since the rest of my Death Guard have Blood Angels Red, that's what I'm going to stick to for this fella. And now we're going to get on to that weathering. What I've got here is a little bit of packing foam, just a tiny wee scrap of that from an old blister pack. It's good stuff if you can find it. You can either get it from blisters from other manufacturers ordinarily, or you can pick it up online. With a little bit of Rhinox hide, I'm going to very lightly, let's start by dabbing the edge of his base and see what we leave. Okay, that's what I want. I'm going to start dabbing this little patches on his armor just to get little random shapes where it looks like the paint has been chipped through action. Now, I'd recommend, as always, less is going to be easier to deal with than putting too much on. You can say less is more, but that's not true. Less is less and more is more, but sometimes less looks better. So just little random splatches of this towards the edges and areas where it's likely you'd probably catch some incoming damage and chipping. You can go over the green with that as well. And once you're satisfied with how much you've added, what we're going to do is give it sort of a three-dimensional finish. I've got some white scar now, and what I'm going to do is, with a fine brush, just add a few little dots of this underneath the chips that we've added to make it look like they are a little more three-dimensional. Don't necessarily have to do this, but it will look super cool if you do. And while I'm not going to do any on the green on this fella, what I'd suggest is that Nurgling green makes a great highlight for that stuff. Now at the same time as that, I've also painted in a couple of layers of white over the plasma coils in the pistol here. Now what color is plasma? Personally, you'll see it quite often orange or blue or green. It's a made-up spaceman gun, so you can paint it any color you want, and I suggest something that's going to complement the color scheme you've already gone for is a good idea. To that end, I'm using Gryph-hound Orange, another contrast color, and I'm just going to paint a layer of this over those white coils, maybe a little bit more on my brush. Now once that's dry, load up your brush with a little bit of white, probably less that I've got here. What you're going to do is very lightly just start flicking your brush along the edge, there we go, until you find where it's going to catch the outer edge of that plasma. If you want to do a slightly more tidy job, then what you could do would be to actually paint in the coils, but this is nice and quick and pretty simple to do. Okay, and now the last thing to do is to take him outside. I'm going to hit him with a matte varnish. I do recommend ordinarily with Marines using a satin varnish, so something like Munitorum varnish from Citadel is quite a good look, but I find that matte varnish photographs better. So for your own stuff, use the right stuff I would suggest. I'm going to use a matte because it will look better when I take some photos. I'm going to pop a base on him as well. The recipe will be in the description for that one. And let's get a look at what he looks like when he's all finished. And there at last, our Death Guard Chaplain is complete. Now I hope this goes some way to demonstrating that you don't need to completely reinvent the wheel just when you want to paint a character for your army. You're really using all of the same techniques that you have done for all of your infantry that you've painted so far, just with 1 or 2 extra details. It doesn't have to be difficult. So whether you are painting Death Guard or Ultramarines, Emperor's Children, anything of the like, just remember 1 or 2 tiny little changes. Keep doing what you're doing, and you'll have some fine characters to lead your armies. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.